Podcast Playlist.
You are listening to Podcast Playl.ist, a podcast about podcasts, where I, Brendan Hutchins, share what I've been listening to and why you should listen too. This is the final episode in my series on news and politics podcasts. In preparation for this series, I listened to dozens of political podcasts. The first 4 episodes focused on the greats, and now I have a list of some pods that also deserve recognition. Here's the quick list, and I'll break them down one by one. 5 on 45 by the Brookings Institute, the New York Times The Daily, WNYC's The United States of Anxiety, WNYC's On the Media, Primary Concerns by the New Republic, and Radiotopia's What Trump Can Teach Us About Con Law. Five on 45 by the Brookings Institute. The Brookings Institution, tracing back to 1916, is a non-profit public policy organization based in D.C. with the mission to conduct in-depth research that leads to new ideas for solving problems facing society at the local, national, and global levels. Brookings brings together more than 300 leading experts in government and academia who provide quality research and policy recommendations. One of their many podcasts, 5 on 45, is exactly as the short title describes, a 5-minute, easy-to-digest monologue by an expert on what Trump has or plans to do. Typically, there are 3 to 5 episodes per week. Each episode has a different reader, and some can be a little dry, but it's always good information and perspective.
Cox had been in a long-running dispute with the White House over whether or not to hand over the tapes from Richard Nixon's Oval Office. And Nixon obviously did not want those tapes handed over, so he fired the special prosecutor, causing then the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General to resign in protest. It turned out, and this is what's significant for the current situation, it turned out that those tapes of the Oval Office in fact showed that Richard Nixon was complicit in the cover-up of the Watergate crimes, and it led immediately to an impeachment motion and vote in the House. And of course, Nixon resigned just days ahead of what surely would have been a vote to impeach.
The New York Times The Daily. The Daily by the New York Times is a staple of the podcast world in the news category. This is a must-listen, and you likely already do. Host Michael Barbaro interviews the New York Times journalists about their recent stories, giving a behind-the-scenes look at how they broke it. And at the end, he gives the day's most important headlines. Barbaro started podcasting for the New York Times with The Run-Up, a 2016 election-focused podcast. He was recently a guest on another New York Times podcast called Inside the Times. This was the latest and final episode of Inside the Times, unfortunately, but it served as the passing of the torch as they covered some of the same ground. Here is a highlight from that interview.
Another show that you did that got a lot of attention was your interview with the coal miner, Mark Gray, and it ended with you in tears.
Yep.
Is there anything you want to say about this or about the general subject of journalism and emotion and how the two play differently in print versus audio?
Yeah, I called Mark Gray as part of a 2-part episode that was about climate change and what was going on with President Trump's agenda relating to coal miners and energy, and how the president envisioned a world in which coal miners were going to have a place in our economy that they haven't had in a long time, because that industry has been fading, and it's in part fading because the regulations are trying to make it fade because there's a consensus that it's not a healthy part of our world. And we had a coal miner on named Mark Gray, who a colleague, Campbell Robertson, had recommended. He'd interviewed him first, and he was a couple paragraphs in his story. And we called him, and as often happens in journalism, but happens in a much more transparent way in audio, is that Mark Gray was just a hugely generous and compelling human being who very proudly told the story of his long career in coal, how he had no regrets about it, and why it meant so much to him. And in the course of that interview, he very graciously turned the questions back on me and asked me if I had been to a coal mine and where my understanding of this had all come from. And I felt a little exposed in that moment, and in a way that kind of laid me low. And I became quite emotional, and I think it had a lot to do with his generosity and his humanity, and also stuff I'm still working through with my therapist about why exactly I had such a strong reaction to this.
Did you make a decision not to edit out your emotional response?
We did.
And what was the thinking?
The thinking was that was the real reaction I had, and that I was allowed to have it, and that listeners should be allowed to hear it and know what the conversation was like and know who I am. And the response was very strong. We got, I would say by the end, a couple hundred emails and plenty more reactions on social media. I would say the majority of the reactions were, thank you for having a really human conversation with somebody who I, by the way, may not agree with, but had never heard from before and never heard from like that. We also heard from people who thought that my role was to prod him and correct him on what they saw as his misunderstandings or gaps in the way he was talking about climate change and coal. We made a decision that this wasn't a rebuttal of anything, this conversation with Mark Gray. It was just letting someone talk about his experience.
Barbaro really cares about delivering quality news in an approachable and consistent manner. The podcast is usually about 20 minutes long and comes out weekday mornings. You can find the show on the top charts of Apple Podcasts or at newyorktimes.com/column/the-daily, and the link will be in the show notes. WNYC's The United States of Anxiety, Culture Wars. Starting as a call-in show to bridge the divide between the right and the left after the 2016 election, and shifting to a similar but expanded format rebranded as Indivisible, WNYC returned to its original feed with a new season and new format called Culture Wars, an episodic history covering the creation of the differences and misunderstandings that define the divided states of America. Host Kai Wright, editor and host at WNYC and columnist at The Nation magazine, each episode is centered on a topic such as why the Republicans deny climate change, how white supremacists communicate on social media, or how Aaron Copland created the Americana sound and how it's used in superhero movies to bring you chills. The episode with contributor Jim O'Grady interviewing Yewande Omotoso about anti-intellectualism struck me really hard.
So what do you think when I say the word intellectual?
The big thing for me with intellectuals is they are thinkers, and they're particularly thinking about society and humanity and what we're doing and what we could do better. There's a way in which there's an engine to society, people are rumbling along. So to have a certain group of people who are pulling themselves out, zooming out to look is useful.
That's an excellent definition. Then she immediately got to the but.
But sometimes they exclude themselves. You know, the way academia can be in a bubble. The word intellectual, it's the word, maybe it's semantics, but it's like special people, you know, who have special brains.
Why does that turn people off, that idea?
Because I think, why it turns me off is it's like exclusivity.
Omotoso is a literary writer. She makes her living with her mind. If not precisely an intellectual, she works in the intellectual realm.
I wouldn't call myself an intellectual.
I know, because even you hear the word and you think snob. The stigma of intellectualism is so widespread that even intellectuals deny who they are. What's up, America? Why the qualms about erudition and expertise, about book learning in general? Where does this wariness come from? And what role did it play in the rise of Donald Trump, opposed by almost every intellectual associated with either party and almost every editorial page, but whose supporters did not care?
We won with highly educated. We won with poorly educated. I love the poorly educated. We're the smartest people. We're the most loyal people.
The latest season of the show has just finished, but all of the episodes are timeless history lessons worth going back to, about 30 minutes long. The link will be in the show notes, and you can hear more about the United States of Anxiety at wnyc.org/shows/anxiety. And WNYC also produces the next show on my list, WNYC's On the Media. Hosts Brooke Gladstone and Bob Garfield turn the focus back on the news outlets and journalists in a frank and transparent manner. I like to listen to this show as a fact check to all the other news podcasts. On the Media has been analyzing the left and the right for 22 years. and from their investigating and reporting have earned many awards, including the Edward R. Murrow, the National Press Club's Arthur Rose Award, the Bart Richards Award, and even a Peabody Award. On the Media, typically under 50 minutes, also features extra episodes interviewing journalists about their stories. Recently, Bob interviewed Brian Butler of The New Republic about the New York Times' new conservative columnist and his initial fumbles with the existence of climate change.
Despite their awareness that the worst possible consequences of climate change could be catastrophic, they nevertheless think it is unwise to devote many resources, hike taxes, impose regulations to ensure against what may be only a 10% chance of civilizational disaster. Now, I wouldn't agree with that argument, but at least it would be reflective of the range of possible outcomes that climate scientists have laid out for us, and that they're willing to take that risk. What Stevens did instead was to make it seem as if the people demanding the most robust action have some hidden ideological reasons for wanting those policy prescriptions in the first place, when in reality, the situation is pretty much the opposite.
This first essay, I think I understand you saying, paints him in an ideological corner in a way that seems familiar to you.
That's right. And I don't think that this is unique to conservative opinion writers, but I think it is a tendency more commonly seen among conservative opinion writers, because in the universe of liberal opinion writers, the government is generally seen as an instrument that can at times be used to serve the common good. When liberal opinion writers advocate for a government response, it is usually to something situational, whether it be an asteroid that's about to impact the Earth, or climate change, or a large population of people without insurance. On the right, conservatives have a foundational ideological view, which is that government intervention is wrong or to be best avoided. That impels them, when confronted with these urgent public matters that we face routinely, they look for more genial reasons to say that government intervention is wrong.
Clean Water Act is going to cost jobs. Clean Air Act is going to cost jobs. Dodd-Frank is going to cost jobs. Obamacare is going to cost jobs.
That's right. You see a tendency to assume the rightness of the ideological premise that government intervention is bad and build an argument from there that justifies it.
You can hear more at wnyc.org/show/OTM, and the link will be in the show notes. Primary Concerns by The New Republic. Brian Butler has an hour-long podcast of his own that comes out weekly called Primary Concerns, initially started with the 2016 primary for president, hence the play on words. The format is an interview show where Brian talks with a politician or journalist about the week's news highlights and thoughtful questions and follow-ups. The guests he lands are knowledgeable, and it's always a kind and friendly interview, so you don't have to worry about getting riled up from hot tempers. Brian interviewed Glenn Greenwald about the future of the Democratic Party after a long season of losses.
Have you seen...
what specific threats did he pose that were not covered adequately by the media?
It's not that they weren't covered, it's that he threatens to open up libel law, and because you have to balance that out, you balance it out with more coverage of emails, or he threatens to amass a mass deportation force, so you have to balance it out with email. I mean, did you see the Gallup word cloud, probably September, October, where they asked people that they polled, what have you heard or read about the candidates? And Trump's cloud is fairly balanced with banal words like speech and immigration and president that mostly make up the bulk of it. And Clinton's was hilariously dominated by the word email. And then where you could even see the other words, it's health, scandal, foundation. And I mean, we can go back and look at every single piece of media about the election, but that's the output, right? That is what people heard and saw, and that, I think, is prima facie evidence of a failure.
Maybe that is, but maybe it's prima facie evidence of the fact that the public has known Hillary Clinton for 25 years and has come to fundamentally distrust her as a public figure, and view her as corrupt for a whole variety of reasons having nothing to do with the media's coverage of the 2016 campaign. I mean, this is what it just always gets back to me, is that if you go back and look at the debate that Democrats were having in 2015 and even into early 2016 about clearing the field for Hillary Clinton, about whether or not she should be the nominee, these were all the arguments that people were making. This is all well known. This all was true before they started covering Trump versus Clinton, was that, look, she's an extremely unpopular figure. People view her as the guardian of everything they hate about the political process, fairly or unfairly, on top of which she's now the subject of an FBI criminal investigation, which means all those perceptions that are so dangerous for people to have about her are going to be exacerbated. And there's this rhetorical trick that a lot of Democratic pundits do where they refer to it as emails, as though that's supposed to be just dismissive, oh, it's just about her email practices. There are laws about how you have to preserve and manage your communications as a government official, and they're not trivial. People go to prison all the time for violating them, either because it might jeopardize classified information or because it lets people have communications by escaping FOIA laws. This was a real criminal investigation under real laws that people have been in prison for with Hillary Clinton's support. She wasn't saying, oh, as these people are being hauled off for violating these laws, oh, these things are trivial, these things are frivolous, we have too much classification. So, yes, you're right that people had very negative perceptions of Clinton that were severely exacerbated by the email scandal, but I actually don't think that's prima facie proof that means that the press behaved poorly. I think that's prima facie proof that the Democrats took a huge gamble knowingly in nominating somebody so unpopular, even though someone like Donald Trump was lurking, that, blaming the media for that is just a way of evading blame. And that's what this just keeps sounding to me like.
You can find more at newrepublic.com/podcasts, and the links are. Radiotopia's What Trump Can Teach Us About Con Law. This sounds like an article written by The Onion. Despite the cliche, this is what I think each time I listen to Roman Mars' new podcast, What Trump Can Teach Us About Con Law. Roman Mars is the host of the podcast 99% Invisible and co-founder of Radiotopia. In his new show, What Trump Can Teach Us About Con Law, he has partnered with constitutional law professor Elizabeth Joe. Together, they check Twitter to compare what the 45th president of the United States has done, says he's done, or says he will do, against 200 years of judicial branch interpretations and rulings on the United States Constitution. Everything is a remix, right? Con Law is Roman Mars' mashup of other great podcasts in a concise and well-produced package. Two of my favorite new podcasts since this administration started are Can He Do That? By The Washington Post, Analyzing the Scandal of the Week by Asking the Titular Question, and Civics 101. Civics 101 by New Hampshire Public Radio, a weekly dive into what you may have forgotten in civics class, or what you never learned because most public schools stopped teaching civics. Con Law mixes these formats with Roman Mars as the everyman, asking questions of Elizabeth in the teacher role, who shares her knowledge of constitutional law. What Trump Can Teach Us About Con Law is as quirky and well-edited as you expect from a Mars production.
Will Trump use his presidential pardon power, and how might he use it?
Now, I want to be really clear here. There have been no announcements or indications that Trump would use his pardon power in the investigations of his administration. But what does the Constitution say he could do? You're going to want to sit down for this.
And apart from the exclusion on impeachment and the limitation to federal offenses, the constitutional authority of the president to grant pardons is almost limitless.
Almost limitless power. But it is somewhat checked by political and societal norms of behavior, so we should be just fine.
The Supreme Court has made it clear that the pardon power cannot be modified, abridged, or diminished by Congress. Nor does the president have to consult the courts, doesn't have to ask them for permission if someone can be pardoned.
The thing about the pardon is that it's used quite a lot.
It's common for presidents to grant hundreds of individual pardons during their terms. Most people we don't really know or remember who are the recipients of these pardons, but there are definitely some that stand out. So in 1869, President Andrew Johnson pardoned Dr. Samuel A. Mudd. After John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln and was on the run, he showed up at the door of Mudd's Maryland home. Mudd set his broken leg, and for aiding Booth, Mudd received a life sentence for conspiracy. Mudd went on to be known for other things. He helped save the lives of hundreds of inmates from yellow fever while he was serving his own sentence at Fort Jefferson, an island prison in the Gulf of Mexico. And a survivor actually petitioned President Johnson to show Mudd mercy. In 1977, President Carter issued a blanket pardon, that means a whole lot of people at once, to everyone who failed to register for the draft or left the country to avoid serving in the Vietnam War. On his very last day in office in 2001, President Bill Clinton issued 140 pardons, including one for his half-brother Roger, who had been convicted of cocaine possession. And maybe most famously, in 1974, President Ford granted former President Richard Nixon a pardon after Nixon had resigned from office.
The episodes are about 15 minutes each. You can listen at TrumpConLaw.com, and you can get that link in the show notes. In addition to the aforementioned, I'll also be listening to 2 pods by Oregon Public Broadcasting called Think Out Loud and Politics Now to keep up on my own local news and politics. You can find out more about all these shows with the links in the show notes. Now I'm going to unsubscribe from many podcasts that did not stand out, not only to spend less time on news, but also because I've noticed my stress levels increase. This concludes my series on news and politics podcasts. I hope you were able to find a new podcast to listen to or found a new perspective on one of your favorites. I will be back in a month or so with my next series on music podcasts. Please stay subscribed because I have some fun plans for this series and I think you'll enjoy it. And speaking of music podcasts, I have actually just launched a music podcast of my own. It's called Nobody Asked for This because nobody asked for it. It is a conversation between me and my friend from high school. We're both musicians and we challenge each other to cover songs. We talk about music. It's a fun time and very silly. Also, we are corrected at times by David Kallison of the Sound and the Story podcast, who just chimes in with a little, that's not quite right. Anyways, hope you enjoy it. You can find it at naftpod, naftpod.podiant.co, and the link will be in the show notes. And I'm happy to say that this podcast is supported by Audible. And you can go to audibletrial.com/podcastplaylist and receive a free audiobook. It's yours to keep. And 30 days access to their other features like daily deals and more. Another great feature of Audible is their exclusive podcasts like Sincerely X by Ted and The Rant Is Due by Lewis Black. Please visit audibletrial.com/podcastplaylist to get these podcasts and any audiobook for free. And you get to keep that book forever. And you also get access to this service for 30 days. That's audibletrial.com/podcastplaylist. This episode was recorded in breaking triple-digit temperatures, Portland, Oregon. Writing and narration by me, Brendan Hutchins. The producer and script editor was Sarah Hutchins. And moral support and infinite distractions were provided by Sebastian and Autumn, Sarah and my cats. There are a couple ways to support the show to keep the recommendations coming. Please visit podcastplayl.ist/support. There you can find my Patreon page and other affiliate links to support the show. For more podcast recommendations and to rate and review podcasts yourself, head to podchaser.com, a new site devoted to podcast discovery. A cross between IMDb to track hosts and guests, and what Letterboxd is for movies and Goodreads is for books, Podchaser is a social home for rating and reviewing podcasts and episodes, and a link will be in the show notes. Hey, this is a podcast. This podcast is hosted on the incredible Podiant.co podcasting platform that has a free unlimited tier and upgrades for services and features. If you're looking to host your own podcast, check it out and send me a link. I'd love to hear your show. Send me your comments, suggestions, and recommendation success stories. I'm at the Pod Playlist on Twitter. I'm on Facebook at Podcast Playlist. I'll accept text or audio messages to the podcast playlist at gmail.com. You can leave a comment on the post at podcastplayl.ist, where you can also see the show notes. In the immortal words of Mike Burkett from NoFX, the People's Revolution is going to be a podcast.
Podcast Playlist.